Welcome to another episode of Rethinking Porn Addiction. My name is Nate Bagley. I'm here with Hans and Doug Braun-Harvey. For those of you who don't know Doug is a psychotherapist. He's the founder of the Harvey Institute. We missed him last week. And he's also the author of the book, Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, which he's our resident expert in this stuff. And so super grateful to have Doug here teaching me and Hans and talking to me and Hans, the normal Joe Schmoes, about pornography and it's the impact that it has on our lives and how to deal with it in a productive way. For those of you who are regulars and have tuned into our previous episodes, you notice probably that we have Jake and Kristen who are not with us today. They are on a much needed vacation. And so we hope that they're having fun and they'll be back with us next week. But this week it's an all boys club. So we're going to have a fun conversation. I'm actually really excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today, what we have planned. For the last couple of weeks, we've been attempting to have a conversation about what is pornography. And every time we kind of start to go down the rabbit hole of trying to define it, we kind of shoot off on a tangent. And they're always great tangents, but we never get locked in. And this week I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. And I think for the purpose of the audience that we have and our conversations, and you guys can disagree with me on this, I'm totally open to it, but my thought is maybe pornography is simply sexual imagery that is unwanted in your life or your relationship. So everybody has some sort of sexual image that makes them uncomfortable or goes against their moral compass. It's contrary to their values. And I think everybody's definition of what that is a little bit different, but maybe for the sake of this conversation and for the sake of our audience going forward, when we reference the word pornography, maybe, what do you guys think about that? Like using that definition?
It assumes it's inherently a conflict.
Yes. Well, if you think about our audience, Doug, almost everybody is here because they don't want pornography to be a part of their life. So there is a conflict around it.
Right. But for other people, the definition of pornography does not include having a conflict.
Correct.
So that's the only thing I sort of maybe, would offer is that is really a high motivation for people to watch this conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But there might be other places somebody might say the word and it doesn't conjure up a conflict, which is kind of why we're here having the conversation. Because for people,
yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, especially if you're in a relationship, whether it's with a religion or whether it's with a partner or whether it's with a child, and you have to have conversations around pornography. It's interesting to me to think that like a lot of people, when they say the word, they aren't on the same page. Maybe they're on the same page that it is unwanted in the context of our audience. Like, hey, pornography is not something that we want to be a part of our lives. Great. But when they say the word pornography, they may not be thinking about the same thing. So is it worthwhile, do you guys think, to have a conversation as a couple or as a family or as an organization and kind of decide what is pornography to you?
Nate, two thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm super stoked to be here with you guys today. I felt myself already leading up to the conversation today, kind of fumbling myself with the idea and the definition of pornography. So really glad to be here in the room talking about it. I think maybe just for the sake of this conversation and listeners, I would, in my own personal opinion, I would pretty much agree with what you said or what you gave offered as a generic definition of pornography. It's some sexual imagery that has some conflict around it, something that we don't want in our lives. Or I won't even say that, but it has a conflict around it. And then I started thinking, what's really important about this conversation? And to me, it really is just the idea of being able to have a conversation about it. And I love the idea of being able to kind of work through that with you two and with our listeners to just give enough space. That's the experience I had this week. It got really interesting as I was thinking, what is porn? Is that image porn in one situation? Is it porn in a different situation? Is it innocent in one situation and bad in another? So I'm really excited to kind of tease apart all of those nuances and see what we come up with here.
So Hans, as I listen to your question, I'd be interested to say more about this. Is it porn in this situation, or is it not porn in this situation? I almost hear a kind of another thread in there of how conflicted I am with this image in this situation, and how conflicted am I with this image in this situation? I don't know. That's sort of what I was sort of hearing, but I don't know if that's what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm going to go back to. Let me jump back to an example we used, and that the sandlot scene of the swimming pool, with all the high school girls in bikinis and the little high school or middle-aged school boys getting excited about it. So my son, when he watched that scene, had a physiological reaction and got an erection, and for him that was a really interesting experience. It's the first time he's ever talked about it, first time he's ever shared anything about that with me, and it was cool to be able to have a conversation around it. And there was not anything in me at that point that was conflicted about having seen that image on TV. I didn't feel ashamed or bad or morally conflicted or any of that. And I don't think my son did either. I didn't have that level of a conversation about, is this a good or a bad thing? I didn't put any kind of moral value on it, just what his experience was. But if you were to take that same scene and offer it to someone who, and maybe this is where our conversation is going, was struggling with the idea of porn and got turned on by this scene of young girls in bikinis around a swimming pool, suddenly there's conflict around that exact same image. And that's kind of where I've been playing with is it porn? Is it not porn? Is it how it's used? Is it what the intent is? I want to know. I'm fascinated.
I want to piggyback on this.
All right, please.
Because I remember having an experience growing up. Yeah. And I think everybody's had this experience. You can tell me if this is like a uniquely Nate experience or if this is something you had experience as well. So did you ever like watch a movie when you were a teenager and then like there's always that one kind of raunchy scene or the sex scene or the more inappropriate scene in the movie, and that's exactly when like your parents choose to walk in the room, like mom walks in right as the shirt comes off or right as the passionate kiss is happening, and all of a sudden you go from like I don't mind this to all of a sudden it's like holding my breath and like wondering, oh my gosh, what is she thinking? What am I going to be in trouble?
Yeah.
Am I the only one who's had that experience?
No, absolutely not.
Because what you're explaining about the Sandlot story just reminded me of all those times growing up where I'm casually like watching a show and then my mom walks in and goes, "What are you watching?" And I'm like, "No, this is the only." Come on. And then like the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment and the content didn't change, but the context changed. Yeah. And then when the context changed, my emotions changed.
Yeah.
So maybe like the Victoria's Secret catalog isn't pornographic when maybe a woman is looking at it and the wife is looking for and shopping for lingerie. But if the man is looking at it and getting sexual pleasure, the content is the same, but the context is different. Does that make sense?
So there's a couple of things you're saying. The relationship you have with the material is one thing, who's the viewer, right? With the exact same image. But I want to go back, Nate, to your story about your mother walking in and what are you watching? Because I want to I just want to kind of bring you back to what you showed us on screen. You literally channeled her face. You kind of scrunched. And
sorry, Mom.
No, and you kind of had this kind of disdainful tone to your voice, and it was kind of reprimanding, right? And this is what I talked to, and I want to contrast this with Hans' story. Right? Hans describes a calm father, just kind of talking very matter-of-factly about a body response to a situation. It's a shared experience, the exact same experience between parent and child. And the difference here is your experience of the communication of the parent. This gets in our body, and it only takes a couple times. And then you will have that your own experience in your body, what you were kind of felt with a reprimanding response, and you'll have it on your own by yourself looking at this imagery. You don't even another person in the room.
True. And I just want, for the sake of this broadcast, for the sake of this show, I don't want my mom to feel bad if she watches this for having that reaction. Like, I get that is the culture that she was raised in and the family that she was raised in. And like, I don't think I believe that the way that my parents treated sexual imagery when I was growing up was they absolutely had my best interest in heart. Like they just wanted to protect me and make sure that I was living to a certain standard of values that we had as a family. And so anyway, I just want to make sure that my mom knows if she watches this, that we're not shaming her parenting.
Of course, it's not a judgment. It's just a description.
Yeah.
And I just want to, I kind of just want to say that no matter what the parental interaction is, it will have a physical experience in the child going forward in those early experiences. So contrast Hans's son experience with your story. It's not a judgment. It's just this is the consequence of these early experiences.
Yeah. And that kind of overlaps with what we talked about last week, which was in order for us to have these conversations live, it requires us to have the same ability to regulate our emotions and our anxieties as it does for those of you who are viewing this. Like to have these conversations with your partner or with your children or with a religious leader or with yourself. It requires you to also manage those emotions and self-regulate and be able to, despite maybe feeling uncomfortable or anxious or disgusted, manage that response so that you don't leave that type of an impact on your partner or on your child or anybody else that you're talking to.
Nate, let me jump in on exactly what you said. When I experienced that with my son watching Sandlot, and he said, "Hey Dad, my penis is hard," or something to that effect, I absolutely had that instant reaction of like, pause, deep breath. What do I say? Where do I go with this? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Anyway, I totally had a reaction that was very uncomfortable for some seconds or some duration. And then I really am, I lucked out, I think. I'm not an expert at this for sure, as everyone can tell. I'm fumbling along through this journey also. But I really am grateful that it played out like it did, and I was just able to have what I hope was a normalizing conversation with him about what he's going to experience for his entire life. But the point of that is these conversations for me, for you, I think Doug's probably had enough of them that he doesn't have these kind of visceral or physiological responses anymore, but they do cause that kind of conflict. And I think that's part of absolutely why we're here talking about it, is how do we even have these conversations? And moving towards a definition of porn for myself, my wife, my kids, those around me, I think can be really helpful.
So Hans, if you would have had a different reaction, maybe a really highly emotional, activated, maybe even a little scary response,
right?
You think that same imagery could have been experienced as pornography in your son's eyes?
I do. I think, and now I'm also, Nate, your experience with your upbringing is very similar to mine. And I actually thought about that, I think, in that moment. It's amazing how quick our minds can move. But I thought about maybe I had some impulse to say, oh, that wasn't appropriate. Next time I'm going to fast forward through that section of the movie. I don't want you guys seeing that. I don't want you guys feeling like that. So Doug, absolutely. I had some impulse to have a different reaction to my son's comment. And I think back to my own upbringing, and Nate, I'm right in line with you. I had a very conservative upbringing. My parents are amazing and wonderful, and just like me, were doing the very best that they could with what they had in their situation. That's all I'm doing. Also, I may be making myriad mistakes. I'm just doing the best I can, and I know parents in general do that. And I also recognize in myself, because of my highly religious and morally black and white upbringing, had a lot of those conflicted moments of this is good or this is not good. And now I'm grateful to be in a place where I can feel like I can have a conversation in some space around tearing that apart and teasing it out and seeing what it feels like to make my own judgments instead of experiencing something that was kind of put on me from the outside.
So do you guys think it's worthwhile to have that conversation then, to sit down and be like, hey, what's okay and what's not okay? Like, is the Sears catalog porn, is, like a sex scene in a movie pornography, is like I I don't know what other things could be considered porn that are relatively innocent. Is it like if you're at the beach and there's a bunch of girls in bikinis, like, is that pornography? Is looking up porn on the internet? Like, anyway, there's all sorts of different definitions that we could go through. Like, is it worthwhile to sit down with your partner and say, like, hey, what is it that you consider porn, and what it is, what do you not?
Yeah, Hans, I really, I think that's a bit of a fool's errand. Think of the diversity of sexual imagery that's out there every day, and how much of it your, teen or even younger child is viewing in places you'll never know. Friends, there's just so many places where these images can be accessed.
Yeah, you don't want to turn yourself into the porn police, do you?
Well, I'm going to just maybe say that one way to approach the conflict with sexual imagery is to focus on which sex acts are acceptable to be viewed and which aren't. So is kissing acceptable? Maybe tongue showing kissing is not acceptable. I mean, we could get down to the smallest details. And I just think that creates a tremendous amount of fear and scrutiny in the eyes of someone. I wonder if a more useful approach is, I want you to be able to come to me and ask whatever questions you have. Is it more useful to be someone available for conversation, or is it more useful to be somebody available for thumbs up, thumbs down? And I think this is an important question everybody has to consider, whether you're in a couple, whether you're in raising children, wherever it is. How do I want to engage in this conversation? What's the purpose of this conversation? And for some people, the purpose might be, extracting parsimonious specific details of every image as whether this is aligned with values or morality and acceptable. That's one way to approach it. But there's an unending supply of those images out there in which to evaluate.
It seems to me that the desire to come up with a definition and to kind of like figure this out comes from a desire to deal with the inner conflict that somebody has around pornography. Because you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of people in the world who don't have a conflict around pornography, and so involving that in the definition is kind of questionable. But for the sake of our audience, it's true, but it's not right. A universal truism.
It's not universal, right?
So is this just an attempt to like find some sort of safety, or like should we be doing something else? Like, should we be trying to figure out why we're uncomfortable with this stuff?
I really think that's because I think maybe what the source of the conflict is might depend on how you do the conversation.
So how do we get to the source of the conflict? Because the desire to have the conversation in the first place comes from a place of, hey, I have a conflict around this. Like, I have a moral conflict. I don't think that this is acceptable. I don't know how often we actually examine why that's true or where those beliefs come from. So Doug, can you kind of help me understand how to even start having a conversation like that?
Well, there's, I think rather than stay in the child parent realm, let's move into adult realm.
Yeah. Can you clarify that really quick? When you say child adult realm, do you mean like actual literal child and adult, or
like a parent and a child? How a parent reacts to a child, their own child, looking at sexual imagery is a whole conversation. But I think that's a conversation that's better done after just dealing with adult to adult, because this imagery is for adults. Let's start with who it's for. These images are not designed for 15-year-olds. That doesn't mean a 15-year-old won't watch it, but that's not who they're designed for. And the majority of people involved in these conflicts are adults. People above the age of 18 or whatever. And so I'm going to propose, let's start there.
Great.
And so some of the conflicts, I think one of them is, what's the agreement with yourself in looking at sexual imagery? And what's the agreement you have with partners, or maybe somebody you're in a long-term relationship with or married to? Do you have any agreement about how each of you uses or doesn't any kind of sexual imagery. And usually sexual imagery, we assume, is also happening, the use of it is happening because somebody's masturbating. I mean, most people, that's why they're looking at it. So is there any agreement? That would be one thing. Maybe the conflict is there's never been an agreement. They've never talked about it.
My guess is in the most cases, the agreement is either not made or it's only implied.
Yeah.
Well, what do you know? What makes you say that? Because you're both like, yep, that's the way it works.
Well, a lot of it is like, okay, so I'll speak from my personal experience. Raised in a conservative Christian community where all throughout my teen years, especially, is when it seemed to like really start becoming a major topic of conversation. It was basically, we don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this. And warnings to women: don't date a guy who does this. Don't date a guy who looks at pornography. Don't marry a guy who looks at pornography, because it's just going to end in disaster. It's a poison. It's an addiction, and it escalates to more terrible things, and it'll just end in heartbreak. And so, because I'd received that type of I've heard that type of messaging growing up, the implication when you get into the dating scene or when you get married is, hey, we've kind of been both raised in a similar situation. We have the same kind of background, and the implied agreement is that you're not going to look at porn, and we'll be good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my experience is the same. It's not talked about in a conversational sort of way. It's talked about in a morally judgmental type of way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even to today exists between me and my wife. I don't recall us ever having sat down and had a conversation around what is porn, and is this acceptable for me to look at or you to look at or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that conversation still hasn't, happened in that clarity and that explicitly today. We've certainly had conversations about me having used porn, and her, to her chagrin and shock, having discovered that. And so that is a conversation that has happened, but having a normalization conversation or an exploratory conversation hasn't. And so I agree with you, Nate.
What's it like to look at sexual imagery when this agreement is in the air but never spoken in a relationship? What's that like?
It's a great question, Doug, and it goes back to something that let me share another funny example from this week, actually, that was pretty interesting.
I love your current events, hon.
So my wife and I we're car shopping right now. We were at a car dealership. We were standing in the lobby waiting for the car salesman, and we looked out the window, and out the window they had in their front lot a couple of those stick blowy men on the blower fans that wave back and forth. Yeah, those guys, exactly. Yeah. One of them had fallen over and was stuck in a tree, and it was going through this repetitive motion that was kind of exactly this way. He was
air humping the tree.
It was air humping the tree, exactly. And I looked out the window and I saw it, and it caused me a moment of uncomfortableness. Like, I was like, it looks like that thing's humping the tree. And I felt this reaction of, whoa, I can't believe I just had that thought. I'm uncomfortable by it. My wife, who was standing next to me, looked out the window and said, hey, that air guy is humping that tree. But she had the same kind of impression of what she was seeing that I did. I experienced some level of discomfort around it, and then she said it, and then it was normalized. We talked about it. We both laughed about it. She actually tried to take a video of it to send to her friend. So I'm getting away maybe from your direct question.
No, you're not away from it. I want you to tell us what was uncomfortable for you, because you're describing the feeling. Did you have a thought in your head? What happened in that moment that you kind of determined this was not really a great thing to say? What was the algorithm?
I think the algorithm was I saw it. I had a thought, and I can't remember. Doug, you can help me straighten this out again. I don't remember if I had the thought first and then the feeling, or if I had the feeling and then the thought.
Yeah.
But I had both, and I thought, it made me think of having sex and feeling some amount of arousal in my body.
Yes.
And then I thought, is that acceptable for me to feel arousal just from seeing a airman humping a tree?
Right.
And so somehow I felt it. And then I felt some level of judgment about, is that acceptable? Am I going to be viewed? Will my wife think that I'm just totally horny and a sex monger all the time, and all I think about is sex because I saw that air thing humping the tree? And she had the same reaction. So she was able to normalize porn. But I had a momentary reaction of, maybe this is bad. Maybe I shouldn't be thinking about sex. Maybe I think about sex too much. Maybe there was a level of judgment about myself there.
Oh, Hans, you did a great job. There it is right there. That's the moment, isn't it? Now think about, what if your son had that same feeling with you watching that movie and he didn't?
Yeah.
The way you described that story, it's like he didn't give a second thought. He just like had this experience and he's telling his dad. But that wasn't your experience in the car dealership. So I really appreciate you kind of helping us understand why these moments are so conflictual, because of the flood of judgment you have on yourself. And you had just some level of excitement. Just, it was a second. It was kind of titillating, kind of fun, and so I really appreciate you walking us through that. That's great.
So, Doug, I'm realizing something, and I'm realizing that when I had a little bit of confusion. I asked you to clarify earlier about the parent-child versus adult-adult relationship.
Yeah,
I think I had just recently had this realization during this conversation that maybe the way that a lot of us have been treating our adult relationships are more like a parent-child relationship. Like there's been in the context of the majority of these conversations, the man's looking at the porn and the woman is the one who feels betrayed. And it feels like the woman is more, the wife is more like the mom, and the husband is more like the misbehaving child. And the dynamic, if they haven't had an adult to adult conversation of their relationship, is one of a parent kind of monitoring a child's behavior. Does that ring true at all? Or
Nate, what's it like for you to say that rather than have it weighed by somebody else? How does it sound to you?
I mean, the fact that it like entered my mind feels like there's an element of truth to it. And I think that's why it's that's one of the reasons why it can be so damaging to a relationship, is because nobody gets married and wants to be their partner's parent. Like, you don't get married and think, wow, I want to monitor and police everything that you watch and say and do. That sounds like fun for the rest of my life. I want to be constantly holding my breath, wondering if you're going to do something that's against our implied moral agreement. And then if you aren't, I have to deal with the emotional fallout and the betrayal and the devastation of, but yet it's almost expected at the same time. And so there's like this, there's no wonder that there are couples who are struggling with this, because it seems like it's just an intimacy killer. I don't know anybody who wants to make love to their mom. And when you
or a monitor.
Yeah, or a monitor.
Yeah.
And when you have when you put yourself in a position like this, where it is more of like a parent-child relationship, it's no wonder that it like kills trust and kills intimacy and kills connection. So
Nate, this is why having an agreement is so essential, because this is this is the default treatment plan. I'll call it that. This is the default way many couples function when they've avoided this conversation.
I want to push on you a little bit, Doug, then, because you've mentioned a couple of times we have to have an agreement, we have to have a conversation, but I think for most people the agreement sounds like this: there shouldn't be pornography pornography shouldn't play a role in our marriage. Do you agree? Yes, I agree. Okay, we're agreed. Shake. That's our adult conversation. So
under those circumstances, I'd say let's make an agreement of how we're going to talk about it when I don't keep that agreement.
Oh.
Because otherwise, I guess the assumption is perfection.
Yeah, and I think in the upbringing that Nate and I have both come from, perfection really is
the
expectation. In a lot of ways, the expectation. Exactly.
So then how do we talk when we don't meet the mark?
Yeah.
because we're human.
Two thoughts. I just want to clarify one thing. It's maybe for myself, maybe it's helpful for the listeners. Do we all agree that a normal functioning male body, when it sees sexual imagery, has a physiological reaction to that and gets aroused or titillated or whatever you want to call it?
It isn't really controllable.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to call it healthy.
Healthy.
You know, I'm a sex therapist. The amount of men who I see who come into my office and say, I don't get a physiological response when I'd like to in response to a sexual situation. And they're not happy about that.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, your son gets an erection at a sexual image. You get a little excited watching this kind of
emotion,
evoking kind of scene,
Yeah.
And you know, and some of the fun of that is sharing it, right? Hey, look.
Sure.
You know, I mean, that's kind of the fun. It's playful,
Right.
You know, and so that's just a degree of just excitement. It's just excitement. It's not, hard. Let's go have sex right now. It's just a level of excitement, sexual excitement, and that's a human biophysiological response. It's the body doing what it's supposed to do, but it's the conflict in the situation when the body's doing what it's supposed to do that is what we're here to talk about.
So that normalization, Doug, Nate, sorry I jumped in. I know I could tell you want to say something.
You're good.
That normalization conversation took a long time to happen in my life. There was a long time where the feeling was, if I had some degree of sexual arousal or excitement around seeing anything, that was an impulse to suppress. And to be able to have a conversation with my wife around, I saw a really sexy image and it turned me on and I got aroused by it. I can even still feel tension in myself just talking about it right now. Is a starting point that took me a long time to get to, but sitting in this room with you two seems like a point that is really important for me as a person and me as a husband or in any relationship, to be able to have a conversation around and to be able to talk about and work through and accept or not accept or explore discomfort around that at some point in life.
Yeah. Think about it. There's no one who's at fault here.
Yeah.
We live in an entirely erotically illiterate society. And so, to try to have any conversation about the world of the erotic or just whatever it feels sexy and, even just a little exciting, we're all mainly first graders.
Yeah.
I mean, all of us. And so nobody's like wrong here. This is just an area of human life. We don't have much literacy.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of normalizing the sexual response and calling it healthy. So now I have a conflict that I want to talk about because the response is healthy. Seeking out that response in ways that are counter to your values is, I think, where the conflict arises. And so, Doug, the question that you asked a minute ago of how are we going to have a conversation about this when I'm not perfect with our agreement of no porn, that brought something up for me because my initial reaction, and I might be speaking a little on behalf of myself and a little bit on behalf of our audience, is what is the balance between how do I even put this? If having that conversation of how do we talk about this when I'm not perfect with our agreement, what's the balance between like having a conversation and then go about that agreement and then going a little further down the road? There's like a line that you cross where it becomes permissive, where it's like, if we make an agreement about how to talk to this when I don't keep our agreement, then am I enabling you to just not keep your agreement whenever you want? Like, am I giving you permission to go look this stuff up without a consequence? Because I think sometimes the consequence is like the fury, the outrage, the anger, the disappointment, like that. The context I have been raised in, like that's the consequence. Is that if you look at porn, you run the risk of disappointing and letting down the people that you love and God and your family and your partner and all of these people. And so like allowing for the space for that conversation around how are we going to talk about this when I screw up? To me, there's a sliver of permission being granted.
Right.
Just
Okay. Nate, in your story, you've described 3 other issues around conversations around sexual imagery. One is a boundary crossing. You have agreements, and then what happens when you don't meet the agreement? That's called a boundary crossing, right? You know, I didn't keep a boundary, right? So oftentimes relationships with sexual imagery many times involves a boundary crossing, right? So how do we talk when somebody in a relationship crosses a boundary of an agreement? And then secondly, how do we manage our emotions? Are some emotions actually essential responses? And are some emotions meant to hurt or humiliate? Are some emotions meant to degrade another person?
Manipulate.
Well, I don't know. Maybe some emotions are used to exploit the person. I'm going to overpower you with my rage and my anger and my disgust. And so therefore, all the power of my emotions is going to control you going forward. You know, these are not necessarily conscious things, but they can happen in relationships. And then the third thing is self-regulation. What you seem to be describing, Nate, is without a serious enough outside punishment, a person won't, in their private moment, regulate themselves better the next time. They'll just test the boundary a little more, as if the person doesn't have their own value system. The person doesn't have their own internal monitor. I like to believe people have internal monitors. They may not be as strong as other people's, and they may need help building that internal monitor. But the idea that without somebody watching you, there's no hope for the person, because they'll just keep testing the boundaries and exploit. I don't know. The men I've worked with need help developing their internal regulation. And oftentimes men are expected to have that without really being taught how to have good internal regulation.
That rings true to me, Doug. And Nate, it ties into something you said earlier. You said, I can't remember the exact words, but there was a point when you were talking about there's a judgment around, am I going to be judged if I have a physiological reaction to seeing a sexual image? Or am I going to be judged if I have an ongoing seeking out of sexual imagery? And Doug, I think what you just said about learning to develop that in yourself.
I call it internal self-regulation. I mean, that's not
internal self-regulation
psychology, but one of the ways we function better as a human being is in the privacy of a moment, all by ourselves. We make a decision based on our morals and ethics and values and agreements and principles and religious tenets. All of that informs us, and nobody else is accountable but us, and we make a choice we're proud of. That's internal regulation.
Nate, I'm going to ask you a question that's maybe a leading question, but when you had a judgment, or when you implied there was some judgment around having a moment of arousal around sexual imagery, do you feel there's a level of judgment for you when you are aroused by a sexual image? Or do you only feel there's judgment if you're repeatedly seeking that out? Is that clear?
Yeah. Give him a moment. That's a great question. That's a
good question.
Number one, somebody's going to need 5 seconds to ponder.
I think context matters, kind of like we talked about early on. So the context of seeking it out for myself, I think almost always has a negative, like there's a shame attached to it.
Okay.
When I just see something that I'm not seeking out, oftentimes I don't really have that response. But if I'm in the presence of other people that I feel like might have judgments towards me, or like if I'm a great example, if I'm with my mom, or if I'm with my dad, or if I'm maybe even with my wife, or with a religious leader, or maybe with a group of friends who all share similar like religious values, and something pops up, I might be a little hypersensitive. Whereas if I were to experience that same thing alone, it wouldn't even faze me. Does that make sense?
Makes great sense to me. That's also my personal experience. Very similar to that.
A clear example. I could watch Game of Thrones by myself.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't really faze me.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to run off and masturbate.
Right.
I can watch it and not be like throughout, because it's a notoriously more sexually free, or I don't know how to put that, but there's a lot more sexual content in those shows than a normal show. But like if I were to be watching that and like one of my nieces or nephews walked in the room, or if I were to be watching that and my grandma walked in the room, or if I were to be watching that show and my bishop walked in the room, I'd be like,
okay, now, Hans, Nate, you did a great job of showing us the emotion. Walk us through the thinking that goes through your brain. Can you? Is it just emotion? It's all limbic. There's not a single
sure, there's tons of thoughts
in there. You know, or is there some thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sure there's thoughts around like, what would they think of me? I don't want to expose them to this. Are they going to judge me? Are they going to be disappointed in me? Are they going to be upset? Are they going to? Is there going to be some sort of uncomfortable consequence that comes as a result of this? Am I going to have to sit down and have a conversation about this is not appropriate and this isn't okay? Like all of those thoughts can flash through my mind in like a second.
My thought just then, Nate, when you were doing that, all those thoughts flashed through your mind in a second. Those are all different relationships that it seems difficult to come to an agreement in every one of those relationships. Is there a place where you and I, as men with a healthy sexual response, can come to an agreement for ourselves first, and that starts to give us some base level of comfort where I'm comfortable watching this. I don't have a moral reaction to watching Game of Thrones anymore. And once I get to that place, then I can maybe even have a conversation with my wife about, hey, are you comfortable if I watch Game of Thrones? I'm not having a out of control sexual reaction to seeing a sexual scene on TV. Is that okay? I guess I sense myself fumbling here again, but
Hans, I really like where you're going, but I want to just give you some feedback about the sentence you chose.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with?
Yeah.
I think that question works against conversation. I don't know a lot of people who are comfortable in any way having these conversations. So I think that's a setup, right? And I want to add another thing, and that I think one of the unspoken agendas, I think one of the unspoken dynamics in our culture, just the way our culture works, is that when it comes to sex, when the person who's the most uncomfortable in the room kind of gets to be in charge.
Yeah.
And so if you're asking somebody, are you comfortable or not, you're kind of deciding who gets to have the power in this conversation. Whereas I don't really hear that's what you're asking of your partner in that moment.
Yeah.
I think there's something else you're after, Hans. And I don't know, can you sort of be a little clearer? If you don't use the word comfortable, are you comfortable? What do you think you're wanting to know?
What I would want to know is their thoughts and reaction to me watching that and not having a moral conflict myself.
Now is this too much? What's their reaction to me watching this and actually I enjoy it?
And actually I enjoy it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not just like neutral.
Sure.
You're not watching a commercial, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's, so yeah, there's some response there, right? And you're fine with that. You enjoy it.
Yeah.
And you'd want to know, what's it like for you to know I enjoy this?
That I enjoy that.
And I'm not conflicted.
Right. Yeah, I like that much better than are you comfortable with? Thank you, Doug. That's a great illustration of how that conversation could go and be more engaging and more interesting than just conceding all conceding my position in the room, or conceding what is or isn't okay completely to what the other person thinks.
Now, Hunt, you did something that I just have been so affirmed by all the men I've worked with all these years. All I did was point out a word you used, gave you an opportunity to reevaluate if that's really what you wanted to say. And look what you came up with. I mean, I really believe men know how to do this. Not every man, but I mean, a lot of men, if you just give them a little coaching, it's there. You didn't stumble. You weren't awkward. You didn't I don't know what to say. You didn't go to kindergarten language. I mean, so it's really just a little bit of guidance, and then men are really capable of stepping up to the plate, is my experience. I don't know. What do you think, Nate?
I want to, do you mind if I create a little shift in the conversation?
No. Yeah.
So in preparation for this call, you said something that really landed with me. And I want to see if I can, because I think it's important to this conversation, and I'm just not sure how to shoehorn it in. But you mentioned, we were talking about kind of evaluating your beliefs, you know, and like in order to understand yourself better in the context of these conversations, there might be a level of questioning your beliefs that has to come into play. Like, would it be appropriate for me to read, not me personally, but somebody who's watching, to read Twilight or to watch Highlander on Netflix and feel some sort of sexual arousal, or read a book like 50 Shades of Grey that was really popular for a long time, especially with women? Why is it appropriate to experience this sexual arousal in those situations, but it's not appropriate for your partner to experience sexual arousal in a different situation? Like, where does the judgment come from? Where does the belief come from? And so I want to, in order to have these conversations, I think it requires us to question our beliefs a little bit. And I think you mentioned some really good questions and had some really great thoughts on that. And I didn't want to end this conversation without bringing that into this as a whole.
Mm-hmm. I remember the conversation. As I'm listening to you now, Nate, one thing I didn't say previously that comes to mind now is how unprepared everybody is for these conversations. So when you ask a good question about, what does it mean to you that I might be enjoying this? Are there moments when you have pleasure looking at certain imagery? What does that mean to me to know that you get pleasure out of looking at something that maybe isn't pleasurable to me? These are really useful, I think, values conversations. What's arousing and exciting to one person may not be that way at all to another person. How do we deal with the fact
that judgments around what is exciting to one person and not exciting to another one?
Well, I think that's the default lesson we've been taught in our culture, to have these conversations. The minute there's a difference, judgments just fill the void immediately. They just boom, boom, all the judgments come in. And so there's little space for error the minute those judgments come in. Then now all you're dealing with is judgments. So I think the first thing is to try to create a space where you're let's suspend judgments for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
2 minutes. And talk about what you find pleasurable about that and what you don't. And can we just say what happens rather than evaluate it? And boy, is that hard. Holy, that is just so hard to do. And so these questions that we could get into, I really want to go to what Hans said. First of all, does the person have any awareness of themselves? Do they even know why they have this reaction? Do they even understand what that feeling comes from? Just having a moment to reflect on how you feel about or think about your certain moment of arousal or sexual excitation are things people take little time to ever evaluate for themselves. They just react to the judgments. So, so there's kind of a two-step process, Nate. I really think the first thing is having empathy for how little experience people have even knowing what their values are and why they have them. And then particularly when sexual imagery gets discovered in a relationship, or an agreement has not been kept, a boundary's been crossed, and there's lots of emotions, and somebody maybe hasn't been regulating as well, self-regulating, there's usually hurt.
Yeah.
And so the dilemma with almost all of these conversations about sexual imagery is they only happen after somebody's been hurt. That makes it tough.
Definitely. And it's hard to it's hard to, when you've been hurt, just step into self-inquiry mode.
Yeah.
That's like a real, that is a feat of human spirit at its like purest level, purest form.
Yeah.
Another question I think you asked that was really interesting, that I've heard you ask, that was really interesting to me, is like, where did I learn that this was good or bad? Mm-hmm. Or have I been told or taught this from a certain authority figure, and have I questioned it? And not, or at least understanding like why is this painful for me? Is it painful because it makes me feel threatened? Is it painful because it preys on my own self-esteem? Is it painful because it makes me afraid that maybe I won't be with you in heaven? Mm-hmm. Is it painful because I feel like I should be the only thing that brings you any sort of erotic desire? Mm-hmm. Like I should be the sole source of pleasure for you?
Including fantasy.
Including fantasy?
Yeah, some people, that's very much how they think of things, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of angles to question, like beliefs to question, and a lot of the beliefs that I think that we naturally, or not, maybe not naturally, that we adopt with regards to our sexuality and our relationship with our partner and our relationship to sexual imagery, are beliefs that are just untrue.
What does that mean, a belief that's untrue? Because I think everything you said actually is reality. I think those are all the things people think. I think they're all true. Everything you just said, in my experience of talking to men, they're all true.
Maybe the right phrase is they're like unworkable. Like the idea, a great example is, because we're married, you are now no longer going to be attracted to any other person of any other person, mm-hmm. whether it's the same gender, opposite gender, or same sex, opposite sex, doesn't matter. Like, right. So there's a belief like, I am now your one and only. I am your sole source of sexual pleasure. And if you seek it elsewhere, it says I am deficient in some way. There's something wrong with me. You're not attracted to me, or there's something wrong with you, mm-hmm. or there's something wrong with us. Mm-hmm. And this idea that when you stand at the altar and say, I do, that some sort of magical spell gets cast on you and you no longer have eyes for anybody except your partner, I think is a fantasy. And so it doesn't work. It doesn't help the relationship be workable. And there has to be an element of truth that maybe that both of us are going to be attracted, even if it's just to a celebrity. You know what I mean? Like, you have a celebrity crush.
You know, I have a new phrase I had, just because you described that so beautifully, Nate. It sounds like a marriage Santa Claus.
A marriage Santa Claus?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And let's think about how it felt when we found out there wasn't Santa Claus.
Right.
Right? You know, and this is the adult.
We're dealing in a fantasy, not in reality.
Right. There's this story we're told. And we believe it. And we don't just believe it. We believe it's essential to us being a good person, a moral person, aligned with the eyes of my religion and God and the ever after. This is a really big story. This is more than I'm going to get the right present. Yeah. This is a big story. And having to deal with the disillusionment of this story sometimes is the work of an adult's entire life.
Yeah.
Slowly, incrementally, grieving this story.
Absolutely. So
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Hans.
What Doug just said about that story, there is so much tied up. I can just feel that in myself. There's so much tied up in that story that I've built for myself over my entire lifetime. It's not something that gets unpacked easily, maybe if ever.
Right.
I'm excited to explore the religious aspect of it in a future episode, because that really is, I can feel that's a very large part of who I am and how I approach this subject.
Yeah, it's such a conflict, isn't it, Hans?
Yeah, it is. To get to maybe tie that conflict back into what we started with today of what is porn. I don't know if I can do this cleanly, but I will try. It is helpful for me to have had this conversation with you. And even as we've been talking, I have started to tease out in my own mind the difference between porn, when I use the word porn and it has conflict and emotion around it, and sexual imagery, which is what I see and what media puts in front of me. And they are not the same thing.
The tree and the blow up toy outside the car dealership was not pornography. It was sexual imagery in your mind, and it sounds like your partner's.
Yes. Anyway, maybe there's a desire in me to try to still give some definitive answer. I don't know if there is a definitive answer.
There's not a definitive answer, Hans. There's not one.
Let's give up that fantasy, right? There maybe isn't a definitive answer. I think it needs constant discussion. And what I like, Hans, is that you're saying, gosh, just being in this discussion today, I find my thoughts being more expansive, more contemplative. I'm not so reactive. I'm not just like,
right.
And so I think that's one of the goals. Can we just be in this space and have the conversation without jumping to judgments and conclusions that just stop all, just meandering thoughts?
Yeah. So to wrap up this call, go ahead, Hans. Did you have one more?
I was going to say, to try and tie that into what you just kind of ended with, Nate, also, or talked to a few minutes ago about having all of those emotional reactions and questions and judgments and feeling threatened about porn. If there is space for us to talk about sexual imagery, and maybe it is just even using the term sexual imagery de-escalates it from porn and all of the emotion and fear and pain that is associated with porn, to let's talk about sexual imagery. And maybe that creates enough space for me to be able to approach my partner or my religious leader or someone else. And Doug, do exactly what you just said. Just create a bit of space to be able to have a conversation, because porn is not going to get defined universally simply for any of us.
Mm-mm.
But we maybe each can start having a conversation. I don't know. I guess that's what I'm taking away from this conversation today is I can maybe start having a conversation around sexual imagery, and maybe there's space to talk about that. And maybe we can work towards whatever porn is in your mind, or whatever porn is in my mind, or whatever porn is in my religious leader's mind. And maybe we start to move towards that together, some understanding. But I love the idea of just having this conversation. And that wasn't a clean wrap up on my part, but I
thought it was good.
Really grateful.
Hans, I love how I watch how you say these really, really useful and important and kind of such honest things. And then you evaluate yourself. So
discount it.
And I just, I want to concur with what Nate said. I just, and I also want to, Nate, that list you went through when you went through all the things that are going through your mind, it was so real. So, I just continue to be honored to be in conversation with you both, and your ability to bring these kind of quiet moments with yourself that are never really spoken out here in our conversation. And imagine what it might be like for some people to just hear these things be said that maybe sound like them too. And that's one of the missions of this experience. So I just want to, appreciate both of you for your willingness to kind of just bring the listener into your thoughts and into these moments.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.
It's conversations like this that helped me and my wife start having conversations about sex before we were married. We were listening to a sex therapist on a podcast, and she would talk about some random topic, and we would listen to it in the car, and then we would go, what do you think about that? And neither one of us would have brought up the conversation on our own. And my hope is that these conversations can play that role for other couples in the world, that they can listen to us have this conversation and then sit down with each other and be like, yeah, are there things is there sexual imagery that you experience, that you see, and then you experience a sexual arousal and I'm not involved? And is that okay? Like, how do you feel about that? And how do you feel when you're experiencing that? And how does it feel for me to not be a part of that? And like, where do those judgments come from? And where do those emotions come from? Is it because I've been told that I'm supposed to have those emotions? Or, what is it like when you really start doing exactly what Hans said, you're giving yourself space to kind of explore and get curious about the emotions and experiences that you have around sexual imagery. I think it makes the possibility of having a productive conversation and creating agreements a lot more realistic. So I hope that these conversations offer that opportunity to some of you who are listening right now. And I'm grateful that you're tuned in. Just to sum up, as we always do, if you want to, we've done a bunch of these conversations. We're going to do a bunch more. We do them live on Thursdays right now at 9:00 a.m. Mountain Time, which is 8 Pacific and 11 Eastern Time. And you can just go to Rethinking Porn Addiction, rethinkingpornaddiction.com. And you can find our private Facebook group or our YouTube channel where you can stream these live or watch the recordings. So thanks, guys, for joining us this week. Next week, we're going to dive into a fun conversation more about, I think, addiction is the plan. With Kristen and Jake, and all 5 of us will be present, and I'm really excited about that.
Thanks.
All right,
Nate.
guys. Talk to you next week.